Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Professor Pippin. Perhaps to many listeners, Hegel's project, legacy, and even his subsequent appropriation remain obscure. So, before we discuss what insight Hegel can provide for the present day left, perhaps you could give us a brief overview, a historical overview of how Hegel was taken up by the left after his death.
Well, there is a movement called the left Hegelians or the young Hegelians, including people like Bruno Bauer and some theologians. And the main um, the main interest these interpreters have was to focus on Hegel's concept of Geist or spirit, a kind of collective form of mindedness. And they argued that what Hegel was talking about was a kind of human community collectively advancing towards self-consciousness about itself, about what it was for human beings to live as best human beings ought to live. This was contrasted with a right Hegelian movement in which the primary emphasis was theological, and Hegel's major categories, like Geist, were interpreted in theological terms. So absolute spirit, which for the left Hegelians was the full self-consciousness of human spirit in its realization of freedom, for the right Hegelians became the concept of God. And this happened almost immediately on Hegel's death. He had a very difficult system, and it sort of fell apart into these two camps almost immediately in the 1830s and 1840s. And these camps, of course, developed. There's a famous saying that the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War was a battle between left and right-wing Hegelianism, between Marxism on the one hand, the apotheosis of left-wing Hegelianism, and some kind of totalitarian elitism, which many people thought, I don't think very fairly, was the outcome of right-wing Hegelianism. But this left Hegelianism got a resurgence in the 1920s and 30s when a kind of humanistic Hegelianism, again not a theological version of Hegelianism, started to be popular in works by people like Lukács, but then also in the founding of the Frankfurt School for Social Research, in which Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, people like that, again tried to make use of Hegel's account of the dynamic of the realization of freedom in history as the core of Hegel's enterprise, and tried to strip the whole systematic nature of Hegel's system from its pretensions and concentrate mostly on what Hegel could contribute to our understanding of how collectively we might realize ourselves as the free beings we are. So that gave left Hegelianism another kind of life. And those are the main strands, even to this day. There are still interpreters who think of Hegel as a humanistic diagnostician of the human condition, and people who think of Hegel as basically a theologian with a kind of system in which the relation of God to his creation is given a kind of logical and systematic interconnectedness.
Now, on the matter of freedom, by freedom, of course, you don't mean perhaps a modern day idea according which you can just do whatever you want, completely independent of natural factors, but rather I take it you're meaning a more socially integrated ideal, one which perhaps for Hegel was embodied by the relation of civil society and the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly the case that Hegel wasn't interested in sort of the classic problem of free will, which is, can we prove for anything we do that we could have acted otherwise? There are always alternative possible futures when a subject faces a decision to make. He really didn't deal with the issue that way. In some respects, his position is more like what philosophers call compatibilism, that it doesn't really matter if you could have done otherwise, if what you ended up doing in some way or another turns out to be a genuine reflection of you, so that you recognize yourself in the deed you do. And in order for that to be possible, Hegel believed a certain kind of social structure was necessary, which, as you're indicated, had two main components: the way in which civil society should be organized in the production, essentially, of wealth, and then the state, the enterprise in which, for Hegel, had very little to do with something like the regulation of civil society. It was essentially very important for him that it be distinct, and that the state be the arena, more like what Aristotle considered the political arena, kind of collective deliberation about the common good. that wasn't just about managing the details of the organization of civil society, but had a genuinely independent function, independent political function, in which this concern for the common good got a kind of public airing. So freedom for him was this very odd phrase of being with oneself in another, bei sich selbst sein in anderen, and that conception meant to highlight the fact that participation in the social world is not a restriction on your freedom, but its realization. There are many criticisms of Hegel that he has a kind of organicist conception of the political, in which you just turn out to be a cog in a machine, or organically, like an organ in a body, and you're free if you do your role properly. And that's a very simplistic representation of Hegel. He did believe that there were social conditions necessary for you to be a free person, and he gave a systematic expression to one of the most beautiful of human ideas, that no one is free until everybody is free. But he had a concrete theory of the social conditions that made it possible for you to see yourself in the institutions, experience them on the ground, literally, as your own.
Now, of course, subsequently people have, like you began to point out, between the shift, or the division between the right and the left Hegelians, Marx obviously being in the left Hegelian tradition, and many times he's been pitted against the Hegel, notably like a right conception of Hegel, one where Hegel, in Hegel's affirmation of the relation to the state in his time, that seems contradictory with Marx that wants the overthrow of the state. To what extent do you think Marx is Hegelian in his sense of pointing out the contradictory nature of the state?
Well, there are two Marxes. There is, of course, the early humanistic Marx, who had a conception of society very much influenced by Hegel. But even the early Marx regarded the state, since he understood Hegel properly, he wasn't really talking about the managerial state, the Weberian state. He was talking about the state as a genuinely distinct enterprise in which competing conceptions of the common good could be articulated, aired, debated, and so forth. Marx thought that whole conception of the enterprise was what he called an idealism. That is, it was a mystification of the social reality of class relationships in civil society, that it wasn't independent of it. And he thought Hegel made a big mistake by trying to understand the state as a distinct entity, in the same way he thought Hegel made a mistake in trying to understand a variety of human enterprises like religion and like art as anything other than implicated in the class relation strategy of a particular age. I don't think myself that Marx is correct about Hegel's view of the state, that it's nothing but a kind of mystification of the class relationships at work in a society at a time. I believe there is some kind of independence to political life. It's not just all a reflection of social divisions of labor, social class relations, and so forth.
Perhaps then, I mean, we've given just a brief history, so perhaps this is appropriate time. You outlined some of the changes in how Hegel was taken up with right Hegelians, Frankfurt School, etc. In present-day consumer society, the likes of which Hegel never even predicted, and where it seems that, to use Lukács's term, the historical consciousness of a proletariat has been greatly diminished. What insight do you think Hegel could lend to the modern-day left in its political philosophy, even in this time so different from his own?
Well, I think one thing Hegel gave us is a kind of model for philosophy, that philosophy had to be located in had to understand itself as located in historical time. And Hegel was really the first philosopher to give philosophy a kind of diagnostic task, that one of the tasks of philosophy was to understand what's happening to us. And for Hegel, that meant understanding whether the enterprise we were engaged in collectively at a time manifested any sort of signs of possible fulfillment, or whether you could already tell that it was working against itself, the famous notion of contradiction, that the very enterprise to realize what seemed to be the collective goals of the society actually makes it more difficult to realize those goals. So he has a kind of model, both of a diagnostic task for philosophy as essentially rooted in history, and a kind of model of how a society begins to work against itself. And I think in the present age, I mean, it's an enormously complicated question because so many of the social conditions of daily life have changed,
right,
and are not really anything Hegel would have ever envisaged. So we need a kind of, and this is exactly in a way what the Frankfurt School tried to do. I mean, given the sort of co-option of the working class into the middle class and into the owners of capital, have successfully blunted the worst effects of capitalism so as to keep capitalism stable.
Right.
The Frankfurt School began to think that there must be other, and this I think is a possible way of thinking with Hegel about how to understand contemporary society, that there must be other agents of change in which the recognition of this self-undermining character of a certain kind of social life could be addressed and criticized, and pressure could be brought. So the poor, not the worker class, the student class, the artistic class, culture itself might be of value rather than in the attempt at the realization of collective freedom, rather than just a manifestation of ossified social relations and class relations, for example. So this emphasis on alternative sites of resistance to traditional Marxist theory, and a reconceptualization of culture as a particularly effective mode of resisting the total dominance of society by essentially by capital. Those, I think, are genuinely Hegelian moves in making Hegel relevant to the contemporary world. Adorno, for example, thought that modernism, the experimental modernism, especially in music, had this kind of political significance as a kind of site of resistance, a refusal to be commodified and commercialized.
Interesting. Now, would you say that how fair do you think it is to characterize Hegel's philosophy as revolutionary?
Well, one of my first colleagues when I started teaching was Herbert Marcuse in San Diego, and one of his most influential books was a book called Reason and Revolution, in which Marcuse did two things. He tried to disabuse us of the notion that Hegel was an accommodationist with the Prussian state, that he wrote the philosophy of right essentially to curry favor with the Prussian state in the 1820s in Germany. And he did that very effectively. He showed that wasn't the case. But he also tried to show that any kind of fundamental dissatisfaction with a society could be revolutionary in some sense other than the violent taking up of arms to overthrow the class in power. So it depends on what you mean by revolutionary.
Okay.
Marcuse thought there could be a kind of, I don't know if you would put it this way, but a kind of spiritual revolution, that there could be that there was a politics that could be aimed at a kind of transformation.
And like some of the cultural elements you just named.
Yeah, exactly, right. And very, very influential in the New Left in the 1960s, when I was very influenced by this. The idea that there could be a kind of cultural resistance to politics, that an emphasis on the transformation of human sensibility, or a different design of the workplace, or different integration of technology, as Marcuse started to talk about in One-Dimensional Man, could be an effective site of resistance. I think what people found in the 60s is that this was not, however much life changed in the 60s, for example, the beginning of the end of gender-based division of labor, 5,000-year-old social stratification. Nevertheless, it was relatively impotent when it came to the worst excesses of what eventually became globalized capitalism. And as to whether that dissatisfaction should lead us to think that there must be a violent revolution in the offing, given how self-undermining and dissatisfying forms of late capitalist life can be, I don't know. I myself am pessimistic about that. The forces in power are far more powerful than they've ever been, control a great deal more resources for repression than they've ever had. And I think something like just the persistence of resistance and critique in all sorts of legal forms is all we have available to us. So by revolution you mean the illegal, that is at a time, the illegal resistance by force of arms. No, I don't think Hegel is a revolutionary in that sense, and I don't think anybody should be a revolutionary in that sense. It's a pretty futile enterprise. We thought that was happening in 68, 69, but it turned out to be, and I mean, you look back on it, embarrassingly inadequate as an analysis of what was happening in 68 and 69.
Well, Professor Pippin, as always, it's really been a pleasure talking with you, so thank you so much for doing this interview with us today.
It's my pleasure. It's been an interesting conversation.